So the next question, you hinted at this earlier, Paul, is like, what's the point of all the laws in Deuteronomy? Like some people, like you talk about like getting stuck in like all these laws. So can you elaborate on like what's going on here, Paul?
Yeah, a lot of the laws look very peculiar to us. I'm not sure that any of us have ever sort of paused before cooking dinner to think, am I boiling a young goat in its mother's milk here? Um, so what's going on with all the laws? I guess a few things. One is the law encompasses all of life. And unusual in the ancient world, it integrates, if you like, social law with religious law. So the laws of Hammurabi in Babylon and Egyptian laws, the religion part of it is not included. They're more social laws. But the Old Testament draws it together. That is, it's all integrated with loving God and fearing God and so on. What God wants basically is his people to live under his law in his promised land. That would be an attraction for the world, because God's always wanted the world to be blessed through the descendants of Abraham. So Genesis 12, verse 3. So the means by which that will happen is he'll bring the people as a mighty nation into the promised land where they will live in purity within that land. And under obedience to God, they'll be blessed as covenant blessings. Deuteronomy 27 and 28 pick up those covenant blessings. And that then should be an attraction for the world to come to God. It doesn't happen in the Old Testament very much at all, not because God's faithless, but because Israel is. So then we see, well, what are some of these laws? Some of them make sense. Don't move a neighbor's property marker because, you've got fixed property, and don't be greedy and don't steal and so on. The 10 Commandments come in Deuteronomy 5 as a sort of preliminary document for all the laws. Some say that Deuteronomy 6 to 26, which is the bulk of the laws, is like an exposition of the 10 Commandments, so fleshing them out in much more detail, one by one. It's hard to say that's exactly the case for every law, but there does seem to be a bit of a pattern. There's laws about leaders in Deuteronomy 16 to 18, judges, priests, prophets, and kings, all of whom will come under the rule of God, which again is different from the ancient world. None of them is to be corrupt and self-seeking, for example. There are laws of ceremonies and sacrifices in different chapters, chapter 16, for example, and a little bit earlier in Deuteronomy as well, not to engage in pagan sacrifice practices or places. Feasts 3 times a year, in particular for the Feast of Passover, weeks, or Pentecost as it's called in Greek, and then later the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths. Those feasts, there's not lots of sacrificial law in Deuteronomy. I think it assumes what's in Leviticus. There's rules of clean and unclean food. That's peculiar to us, I would guess. Having taught in Asia a lot, I know that people there couldn't cope with the clean and unclean food laws because mostly the Chinese in Malaysia particularly like pork and prawns and or shrimps, and they're unclean in the Old Testament. Behind all the laws, though, are principles. There's always some reason for a law, even if it's not expressed. Do not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. It's its mother's milk, not in any milk. So it's not about mixing meat and milk products together, which is how modern Judaism has understood this law. So you can't eat meat and milk in the same meal, dairy and milk, for example, in separate kitchens in kosher hotels and so on. But rather, I think mother's milk is meant to bring life. To boil a young goat in its mother's milk is to bring death. And so it seems perverse, and most likely it's a pagan ritual. And they're being told, do not adopt this sort of pagan ritual. A bit like some of the cutting yourself for funerals and some of the other things where clearly it's you shall not do like the Canaanites do or whatever. So it's putting into practice various principles from God. What we lose sometimes in law is the sort of, we look at the surface of the law, but we don't get what the principle behind it is. And so we do a practice that seems peculiar without thinking about where it fits. In the ancient in Deuteronomy 22, there's a law about a parapet on the roof of your house, a fence in a way, like a veranda. And well, in Israel and Middle East to this day, and in hot countries and dry countries like that, flat roofs are common. And you would be on the roof in the cool of the evening. You might sleep there some parts of the year, dry your clothes there, play games there. You need a veranda to be safe. When I used to live in Malaysia, no roofs were flat. They were all pitched roofs because it's so tropical and so much rain. So nobody went on the roof. You don't need a parapet because it's not an issue of safety. But the principle is safety. And so today we'd say, well, if this same principle applies, as I think it would, is my house safe for visitors? Is my house safe for the elderly or the children? Are they going to run out onto the street or whatever it might be? So looking behind the principles of the law, I think matters. And ultimately, even though Jesus said this, he's not saying something new when he says the two great commandments are love God and love your neighbor. Love your neighbor is expressed in Leviticus, not in Deuteronomy. But the laws about picking up your neighbor's property and animals and things like that, that's about loving your neighbor. And so there is this sort of hierarchy of principle in a way. I think the law both points us to the ideal, love your neighbor, love God, etc. Don't steal. But it also points us to the realism of a fallen world. If somebody's wife leaves or husband leaves and you divorce, then this is what you do. It doesn't mean divorce is good. It's about how to live in a fallen world, which is actually what Jesus explained to the Pharisees as well in Matthew, for example.